We are live. My guest today is Dohko. He is a Mars contributor and head of product at Delphi Labs. Today we're talking about Mars, the Mars protocol, the Mars hub. We're going to be diving deep into the product, credit accounts, understanding the outposts model, which they're innovating on, and why they built on Osmosis, and also the long-term vision for the Mars protocol. I'm also dying to find out why he thinks L2s on Ethereum won't scale. Before we get started, make sure to hit the like button, hit the notification bell, and subscribe to get notified when I go live every week. And remember that none of what we discuss here on the Interop is investment advice. And if you enjoy this content, please consider staking with us. We're validating on Evmos, on Quicksilver, and I'm super happy to say that our Osmosis validator is now live. We are not currently in the active validator set, but just 2 spots away from being in the active validator set. So why don't you delegate some Osmo to Interop and help us get there. My guest today, Dohko, is coming up next, right here on the Interop. Dohko, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, nice to be here.
So, Mars Protocol has launched. I think a lot of people have been waiting for this. It launched, I think, 2 weeks ago, or is that about right?
Yeah, that's about right.
Yeah,
that's close to that.
And it's probably one of the most anticipated DeFi projects in Cosmos since Osmosis. You know, I think it's up there on par with that level of hype and excitement. So we're going to be talking today about the protocol and diving into some of the technical bits here, also the tokenomics and the DeFi aspects as well, the finance, lending and borrowing, of course. But first, I want to get to know you a little bit. This is a bit unusual. It's the first time I do like an anon interview. But yeah, maybe tell the audience a little bit about who you are and what your background is and what led you to become a contributor on Mars.
Yeah, for sure. First, I'll say at the beginning when you introduced me, product at not head product at Delphi Labs. Yeah, just to be clear with that.
Thanks for clarifying that. Yeah.
No, of course. So what's my background? Yes, I have. I'm like my background is in like CS engineering. That's what I studied in school. And then I worked for several years after that in as a financial engineer in kind of like the Wall Street world, in kind of like in the New York area. and from there, so like I focused on several different things there. It was mostly like global macro hedge fund, so like building like trading, so like trading signals, economic indicators, that kind of good stuff, right? And then from there, I got into product and, just like always worked in fintech and been following Bitcoin since its early, Bitcoin and crypto since its early days, to be honest. Like 2011 is when I learned about it. So it's pretty early on. Been always following it. Yeah. Been always following it, be always on the sidelines because to me, it was always like, yeah, it's great, but it's got this other thing, and then what I ended up learning over time is like all the problems that I initially thought kind of like crypto had, eventually that started getting solved one after the other. It's a great lesson of like, if humans, to me it was a personal lesson, like if humans really get to do something, they eventually achieve it. And so to me, what really got me over the line was like the introduction of DeFi, stable coins and even decentralized stable coins with some failures that we know of. But that got me over the line, like DEXs, DeFi activity, like that, because to me that was like really, really the value add and the true ethos of crypto.
Cool. And maybe for our audience and also a little bit for myself, like understanding the relationship between Mars and Delphi Labs and the kind of broader organization that is Delphi. So I know Delphi because I get their newsletter and I know that like they put out great research, but they also have this labs arm that is, I think, is the arm that is building Mars. Can you describe a bit of the organization here and what you guys are doing at sort of at the high level?
Yeah, for sure. So Delphi Labs is an independent kind of like arm. Under it falls under the umbrella of Delphi Digital, which Digital does all sorts of other things like ventures and research to crypto. And Delphi Labs is contributes to protocols, and specifically, it's one of the contributors of Mars Protocol. I would say, yeah.
And it's kind of unique, I guess. I mean, like there's a lot of, I mean, oftentimes funds will often also do research, but I think having a fund that also has such um, a high output lab, right? That is building protocols in house. I mean, you know, in large enough funds, you'll have developers and researchers that are maybe helping portfolio companies, but in crypto, at least, it's not common for a fund to have an internal development house, right? That's building product. What's unique
Yeah.
about Delphi that makes that possible?
Well, I would say that it's not really like that because the fund is its own entity, and then labs it's its own entity. They're like separated. They're like just like different legal entities. They're separated, so they don't. It's not that like it's not like one of these sort of like hedge funds that sorry. It's mostly not. It's not really hedge funds. It's mostly early stage Web 2 kind of funds that also sometimes have like developers in there building ideas. It's not like that. It's like they're independent from each other. So
Okay.
lab its purpose is literally just like to contribute to the crypto space and push it forward basically, and essentially in this case contribute to Mars.
Okay. And so sort of funded by, of course, like funded by Delphi. So they're essentially funding their own products through this labs entity.
Yeah, so I believe Delphi Labs is self-funded. Yes.
Okay, interesting. So yeah, let's get into Mars a little bit. What's the background here, and how did this idea come to be? Like, what is some of the um, early ideas that led Mars to become a product?
Yeah, so we're going back to the early Terra days, which kind of precedes me, but but I was definitely like a user of Mars. So yeah, so I think the idea behind Mars is of course it starts initially as this kind of like as a traditional money market, and we call that functionality in Mars as the red bank, but then it develops also further into like this idea of this sort of like idea of one stop shop place where you can go as a user to do all your kind of like DeFi activity, right? So taking a step back, right? So if you look at arguably one of the most successful products in crypto so far has been centralized exchanges. And so why is that, right? I mean, really, the reason is because it's like this one-stop shop that the user can go to, and pretty much they can do everything on these exchanges. Arguably minus DeFi activities, but they can do that. They can do pretty much everything on the exchange. It's got this kind of like somewhat intuitive like UX. And on top of that, so that's one thing, right? It's easy and it's got everything in under one hood. And on top of that, you can get in some of these like centralized exchanges, you can get efficient capital efficiency, right? So you can do this thing of where you can cross collateralize your positions under one account, right? So if you remember, like before it blew up, FTX has this concept of sub accounts, and the beauty of that concept was that you could actually take one spot position and use that maybe as collateral to take a per position. Actually, the cross collateralization that you have in traditional finance, you have it on centralized exchanges through that. So that's kind of like the two, I would argue, the two things that make them very successful, right? And so like our view is we believe that crypto should, like, the whole point of crypto is to be decentralized, right? And so we want to build kind of like a one-stop shop product similar, that gives you a similar experience to a centralized exchange, where you would go and can do all your activities, right? And under one account essentially, that has the capital efficiency of the centralized exchanges through the cross collateralization of assets. So imagine something, this place that you can go, you can do spot trading, you can do margin trading, you can do so the centralized exchange stuff plus DeFi primitives, right? So like farming, leverage yield farming, vaults, even potentially perps, option vaults, all that under one place with one account one LTV basically.
So I think I even forgot about this, but Mars actually started on Terra, and when Terra collapsed, then there was a question of where it would build the next version, and that ended up being in the IBC sort of Cosmos ecosystem, but more closely tied to Osmosis.
Exactly. Yeah. So what happened was that after the collapse, we really took some time to reflect of what will be our next step. We did really a thorough investigation of like we try to be like as much as we could unbiased and and do research around where would it make sense to build. And it's kind of interesting because we went through this like really deep exploration about layer twos, about like I don't know Solana and other like super fast like things like Aptos and ended up we went at like full circle back to Cosmos. Like this makes sense. This is like really we truly believe in the thesis of the app chains. We like that's also where expertise is, but like this is like where we should be building, and it makes sense. And we actually even published like I think a report about that, fully transparent with the thought process, pros and cons. Of course, there's pros and cons, right?
Yeah, it's this finding a home for labs article. I think that you published a few sometime after the Terra collapse, right?
Exactly right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a great article. I reference that article quite often in when talking about Cosmos to people or kind of pitching Cosmos to folks.
Yeah.
So talking about the product a little bit, I think most people that have been in crypto for a while are familiar with lending products on Ethereum, like Aave, like Compound, money markets in that sense, and have used those money markets. And even that, like if you think back to 2018, 2019, when these ideas were being first discussed, I think for a lot of people it took a while, including myself, it took a while to conjure up how these systems worked. And essentially the way they work on a collateral basis. So you put some amount of collateral into the system, that collateral gets pooled between all of the users, and then other users, or even the same users, are able to borrow other assets against that collateral. I think that's a model that the DeFi industry understands really well now. It understands the way that both lenders and borrowers are charged for borrowing and remunerated for lending. It understands the way that liquidity pools function. There are even now other protocols being built on top of that, like Morpho, that try to reduce the spread between the borrow and lend rates by doing peer-to-peer matching. So I feel like that's a space that's been thoroughly explored and built on Ethereum. In Cosmos, though, we don't have very many of these lending markets. I mean, there are a few. So there's like Umi. I believe on Juno we have maybe Wind or some other. I'm not quite familiar with the protocols over on Juno, but I think there are some lending markets there. And then there's Mars. But the fact that we have IBC connected chains, I think, really kind of introduces a whole new design space that is very different from what we know on Ethereum. What are some of those unique opportunities that technologies like IBC and Cosmos enable that aren't possible in the Ethereum world, and perhaps improve on what we already know in that space?
Yeah, for sure. That's a good question. So before I dive a little deep in the IBC to answer the IBC side, let me speak a little bit about the Mars like unique architecture, which I think kind of like would be a good leeway into that. So what we believe, so we before I even go there, I think I wanted to talk about a little bit about our thesis, right? So so the beauty of IBC is that it opens up all sorts of like potentials, right? And the thing is, it's um like it allows you to do asynchronous transactions across different chains, and that's really powerful. Um, However, at this point in time, for the ability to the concept of synchronous composability is actually quite necessary for a leverage protocol to function on a specific chain. And there's a variety of reasons for this, but I think the main reasons, the two main reasons that I generally go back to are, one is sort of this ability to sort of like bundle within a transaction, bundle multiple actions, right? So like I maybe within a just to give a really practical example, when you do like sort of like something simple like margin trading, right? For you to do that, you have to you would have to like deposit collateral first, then you would have to like borrow some assets against that collateral, and then you would have to trade the amount that you borrowed, which is the short asset, right, into the long asset, right? And that's like 3 or 4 like different actions, right, that you have to do. So you really need to be able, and at the end of those actions, you need to make sure that the account that you're doing these actions on is not, it's still like the value of the collateral is still more than the value of the debt, right? So the LTVs make sense. So for you to do this in a seamless way where you can only do it in one transaction, you really need the synchronous composability of the chain right now. In the future, you could do it for IBC in a synchronous way, but I think right now that's necessary. We're not there yet, I think, with the IBC asynchronicity. That said, that's one thing. The other thing is leverage, which I think is the most important thing. Like so with them. So what do I mean by leverage in this case? I mean not necessarily leverage, but the ability to like liquidate, right? You really need speed to liquidate. And so for you to like perform a liquidation properly and use even a concept of a flash loan, which is the only thing that really allows you to achieve sort of like capital efficiency with your liquidation as a liquidator, you really need speed and that synchronous composability in order to do that. And so that's kind of like why synchronous composability is necessary at this point, but things can change in the future, and I would expect them to change, and I think we will adapt to that.
Can
But
you
I think
just elaborate on why the synchronous composability is necessary? But and by synchronous composability, you mean that all the transactions are happening in the same block, I
yeah,
presume.
that's right.
And
Yeah, that's right.
why is it that asynchronicity? Because I mean, like, look, in Web 2, we have all sorts of asynchronicity that happens, and things time out, etc. I think in blockchain, as things become more modular and chains become more sovereign, and there are more of these kind of state machines that are independent from each other, we are going to need this kind of asynchronous interaction. But yeah, in sort of like that's framing the context. In that context, why is it such that asynchronicity is necessary for things like liquidations, or just to understand, what is the real kind of crux of the issue here?
Yeah, it's just about things like if you remember these actions that I mentioned all in one transaction, like the depositing the collateral, the borrowing. If you were to like, for example, deposit collateral on one chain, right, and then like borrow on another, right, like that would take time, right? You would have to wait for the block to essentially for a bunch number of blocks before you get the answer that you were able to like do that, and then by that time maybe the price has moved and rolling back the transaction. So that's the other thing, right? With the synchronous composability, you wait until the end, and if the transaction, if all the criterias of the transactions are met, you pass it. It goes as a valid transaction. Otherwise, you roll back. You can roll back. You can't really do that in an easy way, asynchronously, right? Which I truly believe we're going to solve these problems. I think there's a completely solvable problems. Going back to the initial thing that I told you that I've learned, we eventually solve the problems, right? But right now, we're not. I don't think we're quite there yet to do it in a scalable way.
Okay, so the synchronous composability is unnecessary to do any of these actions. Yeah, maybe let's come back to Mars protocol and in that context, and how how things exist today, effectively, where we don't have this synchronous composability between chains.
Right. No. So let's get to that. So essentially, our thesis is at this point, it makes sense that there will be multiple chains that will become DeFi hubs, and it's completely plausible that multiple chains will be successful as DeFi hubs, right? So that means that these chains will have defectivity and will have liquidity. And so where there is liquidity and there is defectivity and there is a need for leverage, we want to be there. Basically, that's the thesis of Mars. You want to be there, and that's kind of like where this whole architectural approach of the hub and spoke model, where we have Mars chain, which is also known as Mars Hub, right? that acts as a coordination layer for governance and then for fee collection and what we call the safety module. And then we have CosmWasm smart contracts deployed essentially on the chains that we want to be on, right? Which we call outposts. That's why this model makes sense, right? And ultimately, and we can talk more about that, but that's, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to talk more about this outpost model because it's something that, I've heard many people talk about over the last months, I suppose, probably since Cosmoverse. Sunny has been talking about this as well here on the podcast. But yeah, I'm not like entirely sure I understand the difference between the outpost model and the way that protocols like Aave are managing their cross-chain liquidity. So I think that would be a really interesting different. It would be interesting to kind of make the distinction between the way things are done in the Ethereum world with platforms like Aave and the outpost model, which appears to be more prevalent and at least more practical when you have something like IBC facilitating cross-chain transactions.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So I thought how it works on Mars. So the way it works on Mars is that the liquidity of a chain is going essentially stays on that chain, right? So like so for the outpost model, we're launching osmosis and so like, and we'll talk more about the difference between the red bank, which is the money market functionality, and the credit accounts, but the liquidity that's used there will stay there, right? So like the liquidity in osmosis stays on osmosis basically. And so if we launch on somewhere on another chain, it will be the same, right? I don't know if like Injective Juno, any chain you can think of, Cosmos, if we end up launching there, the liquidity will stay there, right? So we had a conversation in the past where, and this has been asked also in the past by some people in the community. It's why this? And actually, I think this is where you're getting at. Why this versus maybe have the liquidity on kind of like the hub, or have the hub act as an orchestration layer of liquidity, where essentially you can have liquidity on I don't know, perhaps on Juno, right? And then there's need of more liquidity on osmosis, and the hub can kind of orchestrate this and channel that liquidity through osmosis somehow, right, asynchronously. So this is entirely possible. Let's be super clear, within the current universe of Cosmos, and through IBC, and this is also why it's powerful. However, it's not necessarily a technology limitation, because it's possible. It's more like a risk thing, like, because different chains are going to have different risk parameters. Like some chains might have bridges on them, right? Some chains might not. Like some chains might have more
Right.
liquidity than others, right? So the interest rates, when you build a money market, right, the interest rates that you're going to get on a chain are going to be reflective essentially of their liquidity, of their risk parameters, and all of that, right? In the moment that you start channeling out the liquidity from one chain to another, what ends up happening is you're subsidizing interest rates of one chain with the other, and users on one chain are taking more risk than probably that they sign up for, right? Like, I'm on this chain, like, you're essentially like moving subsidizing interest rates, and there's a reason why interest rates are different, right? So so there's that risk consideration to make. Now that doesn't mean that someone can come and build a vault, right, that does that just looks at interest rates on a chain and versus other chains, does some like delta neutral thing, hedging thing, where like, you're not taking like one position over the other, and then tries to arb this kind of interest rate. Someone could do that. Not against that, but that would be an explicit type of strategy where essentially whoever's sticking their money into that knows that that's the risk they're taking, right? Versus the chain versus Mars sub doing it aromatically, and that wouldn't be like a good risk proposition, I think, for the users.
So just so I get this straight, in the outpost model, the hub, right? In this case, the Mars hub is a central point of liquidity. It has contracts on other chains that it is interacting with through IBC. Whatever liquidity. So let's say I'm an Osmosis user and I've got liquidity on Osmosis. Now I want to, I want to borrow some. I've got some USDC. I want to borrow some Atom, let's say, and I want to do that through Mars. Well, one way I could do that is just to send over my Atom over on Mars, and I could do that lending borrowing operation. But I think from a user perspective, what we're getting at here is we're saying, okay, this liquidity position that I have on Osmosis can be leveraged as collateral. And this is where it gets interesting, right? With these integrations where you can say, okay, this liquidity position that sits on Osmosis and sort of has to live on Osmosis, can't really move, or it's kind of tricky to move it. Let's integrate Mars into Osmosis such that for the user, it's very simple, right? They have one button that liquidity position gets added as collateral on Mars, and then they can then borrow some assets and do some sort of a leverage on Osmosis, right? So take that collateral and trade it for some other assets. So this is the kind of user experience that we can achieve with these outposts, right? Is that where we're getting to?
Well, let's be clear. I don't know if I misheard you, but the hub does not hold any liquidity. The hub, the Mars hub chain, the Mars hub, Mars hub chain, all it does, it's responsible for setting governance. So through governance, it can update smart contracts, it can change like risk parameters on the outposts, right? So the outposts have smart contracts, right, deployed on them. And then the Mars hub is through governance can pass changes of risk parameters, of deposit caps, whitelist new assets, right? Can update the essentially the smart contracts. But and on top of that, the way the hub works essentially is that the fees, the protocol fees on the outpost get channeled back to the hub, and they get distributed to the stakers, right? To Mars stakers on the hub, right? I mean, not all the protocol fees go to them. There's a fraction that goes to the safety fund, and and so I would say that. But it's important to understand this is the model. It's just like this hub and spoke model, as the hub is kind of this coordination layer of governance and fee collection, and ultimately holds also this safety fund, and then eventually we'll
So there is actually no liquidity in any case. There's no liquidity on the hub. It's all outposts.
Exactly right. Yes.
Okay, interesting. So we're going to get back to the Red Bank in just a second here, but when I'm interfacing with the Red Bank right now, and I didn't get into I didn't get to put liquidity on the Red Bank because I was I was too late, and now the allocations are filled up. But
we're raising the caps. We're raising the caps. There's a governance proposal on chain to raise the caps, so you have a chance.
Okay, so if I'm doing that, and I'm moving Atom, let's say, into Red Bank in order to be able to borrow USDC or something of that matter, like that, I'm actually not moving Atom there, or how is that actually working?
Yeah, so the way it works is that the outposts are essentially smart contracts deployed on the chain. In this case, in Osmosis, and
Osmosis is acting as the outpost in this case.
Yeah, the outpost is Osmosis, basically. Yeah.
Okay, got it. Okay, I see. Yeah. So Osmosis is the primary and kind of first outpost that you guys are launching. There are others, or will be others, just that currently you've built this kind of privileged integration with Osmosis.
Yeah, Osmosis is the first. There are going to be others in the future, but to be honest, there's a lot of work to further do on Osmosis right now, so we're very focused on that, and we're very excited to be working with them. They're a freaking awesome team.
Yeah, absolutely they are. So yeah, so just going back to this outpost model, what are then the so we have this Osmosis outpost that is holding liquidity for borrowing and lending. Now, if there's another outpost that's, I don't know, on like Windex or something like that, or some other DEX, and you have an outpost there, how is that liquidity? Is it effectively separate liquidity, or is it getting pooled somehow, or is there some mechanism that allows that liquidity to act as one pool of liquidity? And what are some of the complexities and having to deal with many different
It's
outposts?
Yeah, it's separate liquidity. It's like it's its own kind of like outpost with its own liquidity, and it's like a separate chain. And then they're not commingled. There's no, yeah, as I was saying earlier, there's no like there's no like coordination of liquidity through the hub. They're separate like outposts with separate liquidity. Um, there is a safety module we have on the hub, where when it's sent to what it does, it collects a fraction of protocol revenue. And whenever we deploy on a new outpost, and it acts sort of like a backstop in case there's like bad debt, governance can decide to deploy some of the assets of the safety module to cover that, right? Yeah, and so like eventually when you expand to other outposts, governance can decide to extend the safety module to those outposts as well. But and then eventually vote if there's a situation of bad debt and all that. But that is the model. As of now, the liquidity is isolated basically.
That's interesting. So when doesn't pooling the liquidity somehow impact the price of that liquidity? Wouldn't having more liquidity in one place make it cheaper to borrow and just sort of make things overall better for DeFi users?
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier. So if you do that, and again, as I said, like it's not a technology problem; it can be done. But if you do that, you end up one use essentially like one outpost ends up subsidizing the interest rate on another outpost. Like for one interest rate to go down, the other one is to go up, right? So someone is losing, someone is gaining, someone is losing, right? And then the question about interest rates you have to ask yourself is why are interest rates different between different outposts, right? Different chains. The reason is there's all sorts of considerations, right? The liquidity is different, the risk is different. And then so as a user who's depositing for perhaps into Mars or is into an osmosis outpost or borrowing from the red bank in the osmosis outpost, you want to be exposed to the risks of osmosis. You don't want to inherit like and subsidize like the risk of another chain, right?
I see.
So
Yeah, that makes sense.
there's like a risk component around this. And again, it's not that it can't be done. It's just about there's risk considerations that need to be done. And then eventually in the future, maybe like there could be a solution like a vault or something. But it doesn't make sense from a risk perspective to do this thing right now at this point.
Okay, that's interesting. All right, so we sort of come back full circle to the initial problem. I realize. Okay,
No worries.
so how would this vault work then? Well, I mean, what are some of the mitigative solutions here since we don't have atomicity and synchronicity between chains with different states? Vault, you mentioned vault, so I'd like to understand how that might work and some other solutions.
It's just an hypothesis. Like you could build like this kind of like vault that and I haven't like architected or anything, but it's more like you could build like a specific vault that does this thing where it grabs an interest rate, like borrows from one outpost and deploys to another outpost, like taking advantage of the difference in interest rates. But there's complexities around that too because it's asynchronous, right? So like you gotta you're limited kind of the risk there. It's just a thought, like it could be done outside of an orchestration layer on the Mars side, essentially. Yeah.
Do you think that this ends up? Yeah, I'm curious as to kind of the market dynamics that this creates, and trying to wrap my head around how different it is from say Aave and the way that composability between chains is being managed there, where on the Ethereum side you have Aave. It is pooling liquidity from different Aave deployments on other chains. I'm not exactly sure what the bridging mechanism there, and I don't. Is it synchronous the way that they're doing it, or is it asynchronous? Do they run into the same problem essentially?
Yeah, so I'm to be honest, I'm not familiar if how they're doing it, if they're doing it, if it's synchronous or synchronous, and how often they make that. Yeah, but to be honest, I personally believe they're segregated. I believe that like each individual like chain, it's kind of like this model that we're talking about. It's like each individual chain is segregated. I have to go back and review it, but I think they're segregated as well because there's complexity, and the complexity is always the same around shifting liquidity from like one chain to another.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so does it introduce that? I mean, because if there's if all the liquidity, like if you look at the DeFi ecosystem in Cosmos, most of the liquidity is in osmosis. Now, okay, you're going to have some secondary and tertiary exchanges with less liquidity and maybe less activity. Does having to what extent does this push users to want to use exchange or AMMs that have the most liquidity? Because and I think this kind of compounds when you start adding more features and more outposts and more functionality like lending and borrowing, etc. Do we end up in like a winner take all kind of scenario, or do you think that the secondary exchanges are going to continue to be relevant?
I personally believe that there's going to be multiple DeFi hubs that can be equally successful, which it's just going to have its own advantage and then features and protocols built on top, which might be slightly different. I mean, there's order book ones, there's like AMM ones, and like and there's like there's always this argument which one's better, but yeah, so I like it. I think in the same way that there's a lot of centralized exchanges, and they're offering the same product. It could be multiple DeFi hubs that are successful. To be honest.
Yeah, I think Osmosis also wants to do outposts on other Cosmosm chains.
Yeah, I do like yeah. I don't know the detail of that, but yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. This is like I must admit here. I'm learning as I'm going here because Mars is not a protocol that I've spent a lot of time researching, and so I'm kind of figuring out also how this works and building my mental model around it as we're having this
Yeah,
conversation. But
I would let me just add one thing. I think the main reason why liquidity is segregated across different chains, even for things like Aave and Compound and all that, the main reason and it's because literally what happens is like in the moment that you start unifying the liquidity, creating this coordination layer of liquidity, you're only as secure as the least secure chain where you're on, basically.
absolutely.
Because that gets
Yeah.
hacked, then like all the liquidity funnels there like automatically, because like, and all of a sudden like you're just like it's kind of like you're only as secure as your least secure point, right? So I think that's the main reason why we're not there yet.
Hmm. Does the hub do price coordination as well between these between the different outposts, or is it not involved in that at all?
Yeah, I don't know. What do you mean by breast coordination?
Well, is it acting also as uh, an oracle to align pricing between the different? Because it feels like if it's connected to all the chains, it could also maybe serve a role in um, homogenizing prices between different chains. No.
Yeah, so I think you're talking about like sort of like price oracles.
Yeah.
If yeah. So to be honest, I don't know if the hub is providing that kind of service, but there is there are specific price oracles out there that eventually I think will get to Cosmos. So things like Chainlink, Pith that do that. They're pretty good at doing that.
Yeah, what I mean is like since the Mars hub is connected to all these DeFi hubs, to all these other DeFi chains, it could act as an oracle. So if Osmosis wanted to know what the price of some asset is over on another chain that you have an outpost on, that outpost could be getting the price over on that chain and feeding it to Osmosis, such that it creates it's like an additional layer of data that the Mars protocol, by virtue of being connected to all these other chains, can provide to the ecosystem of chains that's connected to it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Like, I see what you're saying. Yes. Yeah, potentially. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's look at the products then. So there are two products. There's the Red Bank and there's Fields of Mars. Yeah, can you describe the two products and then we'll go a little bit more into detail for each.
Yeah, for sure. So the Red Bank it's like a traditional money market type of functionality, like the Aves that you mentioned earlier. It's pretty much similar, right? A user can deposit assets in the Red Bank, and then they can borrow assets using the assets they deposited as collateral. So they have there is for all the assets they deposited under their account. Essentially, they have a health factor. That's how we call it. It's essentially just like a max LTV of the account, and of course they can borrow over collateralized, right? So that means that the value of their collateral is superior to the value of their depth by a certain margin, and if that kind of like margin is hit, then basically they can be liquidated, right? So to make sure that the protocol is always solvent. So traditional money market functionality, nothing new at this point there, if it makes sense. And then so the next piece of functionality, so we have released that, right? We released that, raised the caps. So we're raising the caps there as well. And then that's pretty important piece of functionality, pretty important solid DeFi primitive to achieve leverage. And it's like I think like it's fundamental for a chain like Osmosis to have. The next thing we're releasing soon is our credit accounts. Credit accounts are a new DeFi primitive in Cosmos. Essentially, it's going back to the analogy of the centralized exchanges. It's kind of like, think of it as like a sort of like account where you can do all your DeFi activity on it, right? So the potential of that is that you can do things like margin trading. You can do things like leverage yield farming. You can do things like leverage vaults. In the future, maybe even potentially perps, right? And each individual asset that you're holding in your account can act as collateral for another asset, right? So that's kind of like the concept behind the credit accounts. So how does it? And you can essentially borrow. You can achieve leverage on the credit accounts. That is like 2-3x or potentially more of the amount of deposited collateral that you have, right? So in that sense, it's not. So the account will always be over collateralized, right? And I'll explain to you what that means in a second. But from a user perspective, he's getting more. He's basically able to borrow multiple with leverage that's like more, that has more value than his collateral in his account. So that's quite innovative, if that makes sense. And we can talk more how that works.
Yeah. So maybe just explaining how this looks like from the user perspective. So let's say on Aave, you want to borrow some ETH, you would deposit a sorry, if you want to borrow USDC, so you want to borrow $100 of USDC, you would have to deposit like $150 of ETH or something like that, right? You have to over collateralize. This is money markets on crypto as we've known them for years. With Mars, though, you would be able to borrow 100 USDC. You could deposit $50 in collateral or some lower amount. So if in effect, it kind of feels under collateralized, but what's actually happening is that those borrowed assets, you're not just taking them and like moving them to another chain or like doing whatever you want with them. They are sitting inside of a contract, and that contract has specific functionalities that it can allow. And so the assets that you will be borrowing with that money, which is essentially what you're doing with a credit account, you're getting that collateral, you're getting that money in order to be able to leverage it to do something else, right? Like purchase some other asset or invest in some other asset or yield farm or something like that. The contract itself will be over collateralized relative to the collateral that the user put in, because those borrowed assets are also going against the borrowed position. Is that a good way to describe it?
That's a perfect way to describe it. You got it 100% right.
Okay.
Like,
so
the short synthesis is, I can borrow more than the value of the assets I deposited. So from my perspective, it's under collateralized. But unlike Aave, I can't take the money and run. The money that what I'm borrowing stays in the account, right? So that means at the account level, at the smart contract level, it's actually over collateralized, right? So because it's there, because through the account, you only have a specific set of whitelisted actions. And if you want to withdraw, you can. But when you're withdrawing, it's always making sure that you still are over collateralized within the account. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And does at any point, I mean, does that account, so you could add more collateral to that account, which would then increase your ability to borrow or your ability to leverage for the user. What kind of leverage, what multiple leverage are we looking at here in terms of what the protocol will be able to allow?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So let me start by saying that. So and let me throw a little bit of terminology out so that people are have it clear, right? So the credit account primitive, we're calling that the rover. So the rover credit accounts. So then when people hear rover, that's what it means. But a rover is also the name of the contract. So But anyway, so the rover credit accounts. Within rover, the credit accounts, there's things you can do like margin trading, leverage yield farming. So we're only going to allow one functionality at launch for now, which is going to be leverage yield farming. Okay, and we'll talk more about how that works. Later on, in a future time, we're going to enable the other functionalities like margin trading, cross collateralization, all that. But when we're starting, we're starting with just this because it's a new primitive. There's this, we just want to make sure we're being responsible. Now, with that, to get back to your question, how do we determine how much leverage the user can take? So we actually published a risk framework that we believe it's quite innovative. That it's pretty comprehensive way of looking at how we assess, sort of like how do we determine the amount of leverage that a user can take against like assets, right? And in this case, leverage yield farming, the asset is a vault, right? It's an Apollo vault. But how do you do that, right? And so there's the methodology walks through the whole, the framework walks through the whole methodology, and again, that's just like an initial suggestion, of course, and what we think makes sense to follow. Of course, anyone can suggest through governance either a different methodology or an update to the risk risk framework, so to risk parameters. But that methodology is actually quite conservative. And if you look at what are we going to be launching to begin with, we're going to be launching Apollo vaults, auto compounding vaults on Osmosis LPs, passive liquidity, and there's only two vaults that we're launching right now, that we're going to be launching. One is Osmo Atom, 14-day locked vault, and the other one is Osmo Axler USDC, 14-day. And if you look at the risk parameters, they're quite conservative. You're not going to be able to do leverage more than 2.5, close to 3x leverage. I would have to look, but it's around 3x leverage at most that you can do. And that's the most that you can do. And of course, if you're going to do that, I would encourage everybody to be responsible, because like the higher leverage means higher potential return, but it also means higher risk. And the risk there is you get liquidated. So like, but that is the maximum leverage around that number, basically, that parameter, 3x, which means that if you deposited $50 worth of Osmo or Atom or both, you can only, actually, one of the two, you would be able to borrow up to $100, so that your position is like 150 with $50 of collateral, right? If that's 3x, it's around that.
Okay. So can you maybe just describe this leverage yield farming and how that works? And is it leveraging Apollo? Is that?
Yeah. So the way it works is this, right? So it leverages leverage yield farming leverages the Apollo. So Apollo is building and releasing soon auto compounding vaults. What these vaults do is that they allow users to take a position in an LP on Osmosis. The vault will have a specific lockup period. So like if you take like Osmo Atom on the 14-day vault, it will lock your assets on the 14-day lockup period. And then all it does is basically, collects their rewards, I believe, on a daily basis, and auto compounds them. I don't know. I think it's daily, but I need to double check. It auto compounds those rewards, right? And that's basically how it works. It's just an automation tool over the LPs. And so after the launch, when we launch our rover, what we'll be doing is we'll be whitelisting these two vaults, the 14 days of those two, and the typical user experience, which I think is where you're getting at, is going to be that a user will come on essentially what we call farm, right? The field, you're farming the fields of Mars. And he will open an account, a credit account, a rover account. It will be seamless for him, that process, but he will essentially pick an asset he wants to deposit into the account, which Osmo Atom or XLR USDC is one of the 3 whitelisted assets. And then pick the amount of leverage he wants to take, right? So does he want like 2x leverage, 3, if it's 3x, or less, I don't know. And then what the system will do, the front end will do, it will borrow the other asset, right? So if they can deposit Osmo, Atom, or both, right? And then pick one asset to borrow from the right bank. And so then it will borrow the asset. It will kind of use a zapper and make sure that it's 50-50, put it into an LP, and then stick that essentially into the Apollo vaults, right? So the user will have in his account the vault LPs with the amount of with his exposure, right? I don't know if he started with $50, maybe he has 150, right? And then it will have an amount of depth that he owes the red bank, basically.
Okay.
I hope that was clear. It wasn't too much.
Yeah. Is the idea here also for, like, to what extent are these strategies built by the Mars team? And to what extent can, say, in the future, users of the protocol suggest or build or propose strategies for other users to use? Is there a social component here that might be interesting to explore in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we want to encourage anybody that has an idea of building a vault, right? For Mars, and we want to encourage them to engage with us on Discord, show us the idea, and then like if then we can be like there's different things we can do, but basically the idea is like, yeah, anybody who has a good idea wants to build a vault, we absolutely encourage them to initiate that conversation with us. And if you like if the vault is a good idea and gets voted and all that, then and it goes through governance, and then we can assign a risk parameter to it, and we win eventually whitelisted from Mars. I think it is definitely it is a crucial component for other people to come in and build and help us build these things. Yeah, for sure.
So what are the risk parameters that get taken into account when evaluating a strategy? I mean, of course, I understand right now you guys are building these strategies and have most of the control over those strategies. But when determining which strategy is a good strategy and which white label service is allowed in the vault, the rover vault, or maybe sorry, in the rover account. What kind of things are you looking at in terms of determining what is the level of risk? Are you looking at the stability of the protocol that you're interacting with, or like the security of the chain? Is it at that level of the stack, or is it mostly financial risk, such as like the amount of liquidity in these liquidity pools, or the APYs, or what's the level of depth that is being taken into account when looking at risk parameters?
Yeah, for sure. So first I would say that generally vaults are an automation tool, right? So for example, in this case, it's like the ability to collect rewards and auto compound them, right? And so that's what they do, right? Think about the urine vaults and all that, right? And anybody can come up with an idea and can sort of like, we can discuss about it, and and it goes through governance, and then you vote for it or not, right? So the risk parameters are the same, right? The risk methodology that's out there, again, how does that? I can tell you how that works, but again, that's like it's not set in stone, right? That's just like a suggestion of a methodology to be used. Anybody can come in and suggest another one, as I said earlier, but the methodology itself has qualitative and quantitative components. So there's like things like smart contract risk. There is things like sort of like so just these qualitative components, right? Yeah, and then I can't come up with other ones right now, but there's like a bunch of them, and it's in the methodology. And then there is like sort of like, so these are qualitative, but then there's like quantitative components, right? So, and the qualitative generally are like things like yes and no, kind of like that doesn't meet this criteria, yes, okay, let's move forward, right? If they'll meet the criteria, generally, like, and it's all transparent, it's all there. But basically, if you meet the criteria, like, yeah, then let's look at the quantitative ones. The quantitative ones generally are things like, we use a concept of sort of like value at risk, which is really used the traditional finance, and we just look that just tells you kind of like the risk associated to price movements of that asset, right? There is also things like liquidity adjustments, right? If this is a bridged asset versus a non-bridged asset, if it's like what's the current liquidity and the depth of that liquidity on chain, right? There's all these adjustments, but from this kind of like value at risk, right? But ultimately, what it's trying to tell you, if you take a step back and without getting too much into quantitative stuff, ultimately the goal is how much how much risk, how much should this collateral, in this case the vault is the collateral, right? How much do we trust this collateral to be like kind of like an asset that is kind of like that doesn't like move, that's price risk is kind of like the volatility that it has. It's probably associated to like the amount of like to the value we want to give to this collateral, right? Plus the considerations to make on its liquidity, basically, right? And on top of that, it's not, to be clear, I just want to add one thing, and it's not just about this kind of like these qualitative components of the risk parameters and all that, and it's and the max LTVs, right? So the amount of collateral power that we want that to have, right? It's not just that. It's also about, we also have another risk parameter, other risk parameters called that we call deposit caps, which limits the exposure of total kind of like assets, that total like exposure to that asset, basically, right? So for example, like when we talk about raise the caps, that those are deposit caps, basically, and that protects you from all sorts of other risks, as well. Yeah, a big one being liquidations, because when you have an asset, like the way liquidations work, right? The liquidator will pay a depth asset and will ask when it will ask a specific asset on the account that is collateral, and then generally the liquidator is delta neutral, so what they'll sell that asset, right? So if the spread, if the slippage that they're getting on that asset is higher than like the liquidation bonus they're getting on it, it's not convenient for them to do that, right? So that's a consideration that goes into these deposit caps, right? If like for the accounts at risk, if they were most of them get liquidated, what would be the slippage, right? And would that make sense for liquidators, right? So you got to balance these things. Essentially, a leverage protocol, it's really important that it gets the risk methodology right, and that's why we spent a lot of energy into that. And we're open to suggestions like to improve it and all that from the community.
So Fuel of Mars is really the initial product that brings some amount of innovation, I suppose, because I mean the Red Bank is a lending protocol. We've seen these protocols exist in crypto. The Red Bank, I think, is really where the Fields of Mars is really where a lot of the innovation is coming from. Is the idea here for platforms that have outposts, so the Osmosises, the Windexes, the Loop Finances, etc. Is the idea for these protocols to also leverage Mars to build their own products in-house using the Mars platform, or would that building mostly come from the Mars team as they deploy those contracts to existing chains?
Yeah, so as of now, Mars contributors are like, I think they're planned to be that they're responsible for deploying outposts on future chains, but we're talking about like the future right now. Like, yeah. So
basically in the future, will there be like a Mars SDK that allows chains to deploy an outpost and build all kinds of innovative DeFi products leveraging the tools that Mars provides?
Yeah, it's not planned at this point, but anything is possible, basically. Yeah.
Okay. But is that the product vision long term, that Mars is? Because I'm trying to understand, like, what is the benefit what's the benefit for a chain to be connected to Mars?
The benefit of the chain is
Yeah.
the benefit. So first of all, like I think like you hit the nail in the head when you mentioned that the greatest innovation is the DeFi primitive of the credit accounts. That's for sure. And ultimately the goal of a chain to have an outpost on is to gain, as we discussed earlier, to gain capital efficiency. And so like and kind of like, yeah, because that's what leverage does. Leverage ultimately helps you achieve capital efficiency, and you're deploying capital in a more efficient way. But on top of that, capital efficiency is just not just about the use of leverage. It's also like the ability to cross collateralize assets in an account, right? So it's like this gain of capital efficiency through leverage and cross collateralization. That's essentially what Mars offers, right? And then on top of Mars, then I would also add, because we didn't discuss much about that, it's not just about the credit account itself and the functionality that it has. The credit account itself is an NFT. It's transferable, and there is all sorts of protocols that you can build on top of the credit account itself potentially, right? You can build like secondary market on the NFTs. You can build like money manager type of functionality between the red bank. Even on the red bank, you could build. There's all sorts of like sort of like stable lending. There's all sorts of awesome protocols that can be built over both primitives essentially.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to understand is, let's say I'm Seb Chain and I'm a massive DeFi protocol. Like an AMM, for instance, and I want to build in a lending protocol. I could take the Mars contracts and deploy them on my chain and essentially own that whole part of the DeFi stack without Mars. Like I wouldn't need to be a Mars outpost, because what I've learned here is that Mars is a coordination mechanism, right? So there's governance and things of that nature. But what is the real benefit of being connected to Mars, other than just like what it is building in the protocol, which is open source and can be deployed right on the chain?
Yeah, so you can definitely do that in the same way that you can do it Aave and other protocols, right? And any other protocol, basically, you can just like fork them and launch them on a chain. I think there's several advantages. The first one that comes to mind is, as I said earlier, the safety module. So when you connect to the Mars, when you're connecting the outpost to the Mars hub, essentially the safety module can cover bad debt, right? Potentially. So like you're kind of like adding that kind of insurance, which scales really well as chains grow and the safety module accumulates fees. It gets easier and easier to add chains because and you have that protection, which is big insurance, right? So that is huge advantage that you have already against someone else. And on top of that, we're going to add soon like a backstop module, which it further strengthens essentially the concept of the safety module, where if you are a staker in Mars protocol, and the safety funds are not sufficient to cover a loss of bad debt, right? You can get slashed, right? And a percentage of your tokens can get slashed. They can be sold back in the market to cover those bad debt, which does a really important thing, which is it makes stakers in Mars have skin in the game. So if governance makes bad decisions on governance parameters or on risk parameters or like what assets to whitelist and all that, they ultimately pay the price, right? So it's just this thing that if you add more chains, you get this scalability, which to me is really, really important for a leverage protocol, for a debt protocol.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Like, yeah, having this backstop, I think is an interesting aspect, but also having this form of insurance that ensures that that the collateral, that you have this insurance backstop that is the security module, that is essentially like it is kind of the service that Mars is providing to chains that connect to it, right?
Yeah,
it is the core of the value proposition. I mean, other than the code that you guys have written and that you provide to chains that leverage the Mars protocol, this pooled security, this pooled capital in the security model is kind of the core of the value proposition of being connected to Mars.
I say it's one. Yeah, it's one of them. Yeah.
Okay.
But there's other things we're going to build in the future in Mars Hub, and so stay tuned.
Yeah, being part of an ecosystem, has its advantages as well. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, so something you mentioned at the top of the episode that I wanted to also ask you before we wrap up here is, you said that you think that L2s on Ethereum won't scale, and so I want you to expand on that a little bit and describing why you think that is.
Yeah, so let's be clear. I didn't say that. I believe that. So first of all, I believe the L2s are actually
I
awesome.
paraphrased it. Sorry.
Yeah. So I think it's an awesome expansion of Ethereum, and I think they make a lot of sense. There's a lot of advantages they have. The thing that I do wonder, and it's I believe they can scale. And in fact they probably will, especially if the ZK technology gets up to speed, right? What I'm challenged a little bit with is the centralization of sequencers, the sequencers implied, right? Because like right now they're hyper centralized entities, right? So I do wonder. So there's several value propositions that they have, right? Trustless, like bridging and all that. But one of the value propositions is that they're fast, right? But they're fast because they have a centralized sequencer. So the question I have is, once that becomes decentralized, can they maintain that speed and that value proposition, right? And I don't know, to be honest. Again, as we've said at the beginning, like as long as you put your head into something, eventually you'll build it and it will work and you'll solve that problem. I think this is a solvable problem. I just think that that's the only challenge that I see there to solve, which I think everybody knows as well. So I'm not really saying anything particularly new, I would say.
Well, what are you think are what do you think might be some solutions there? I mean, do you think we can actually decentralize sequencers? And I mean, for me, as I spent quite a lot of time in the crypto space and looking at ways people try to engineer their way around decentralization, it just seems that everywhere you turn there is like another thing that needs to be decentralized. If it's not validators, it's relayers, and if it's not that, there's going to be sequencers, and then you're looking at interoperability, right? So like we need at first we needed bridge operators to be decentralized such that there wasn't like a one entity that could leave with funds, and that introduces like more decentralization. So like at which point does this become an endless sort of battle, constantly trying to decentralize systems that might be more efficient if they were centralized?
It's a really good philosophical question. I will tell you that in the end of the day, what is it? How is it in English? Perfect is the enemy of good. So, I think in my experience, you want to work towards the 80-20. You're not gonna if you want to achieve perfection and send decentralize everything, and I'm not saying ideally you get there, right? But sometimes you gotta sometimes that's not the best solution, like you mentioned, right? Sometimes there's some level of centralization that could be acceptable depending what it is, right? It's all a matter of risk, and it's all a matter of optimizing that 80-20. And once you have that, you can't optimize for everything, right? You have to get to a point where you're comfortable, you're able to accept the risk of what you cannot optimize, basically.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's true, but I think there are forces in the space, and certainly like a lot of people who try to push the narrative that if everything is not decentralized from day one, it's basically useless. And I think that's wrong. I think that things that have been successful oftentimes started as not so decentralized, but then decentralized over time. Um, and then there is, I think, a happy middle. Right? If you look at the entire Cosmos space and the security model of the Cosmos space, I think is a sufficient middle ground in terms of decentralizing the validator set and having finality in fast blocks versus Ethereum and all the complexities around the consensus there, where you have a very decentralized validator set, although under the hood, under the covers, you realize that most of it is Lido, but where essentially that that fully, wanting to be fully decentralized actually creates complexities in terms of block finality and like 2-slot finality, etc. I can't remember who it was that came on the podcast recently. I think it was Rick Dudley who said something to the effect that Ethereum spent 7 years trying to scale and trying to do so in a decentralized way, but in the end, did they really gain so much from wanting to go all the way towards decentralization? Could Ethereum have achieved as much or not more had it scaled quicker, but compromised on those very rigid ideas of decentralization? And it's an important philosophical question. I think like one that lots of communities in the space have been wrestling with for a while.
Yeah. But to be honest, it's a good sort of like goal to have. Keep it in mind and
absolutely
and work toward that. I think that's we should take that instead of like saying, hey, it's not fully decentralized. This is like thing that's not decentralized, so it doesn't work. And no, man, like it's a matter of risk, right? Everything that is not perfect, or it adds risk. Now the question is, are you willing to accept that risk, and do you understand it, right? So eventually, we want to minimize all the risk possible, but it doesn't mean something is not perfect. Doesn't mean it's not, it doesn't work, right? So yeah. I completely agree with you, basically.
So as we've been chatting here, I've been thinking about what this product effectively brings to the next wave of DeFi innovation. And I was also thinking about FTX and what most people were using what a lot of people were using that platform which was leverage. And the entire thing sort of collapsed because of leverage. Also, to some extent, Terra collapsed because it was overly, or like the anchor product was like a highly leveraged product. Is the next wave of DeFi products just more leverage, but on chain, where like traditionally centralized exchanges have been fulfilling that user need, but now we're going to have it on chain?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer your first part of your question first, and then I'm going to get to the second one. The first part being sort of like leverage, causing essentially FTX to collapse and Terra. So I think there's more than that that made FTX collapse. There's a whole
of
sort
course.
of like
yeah.
So not necessarily. I wouldn't say it was just leverage. It was improper use of people's resources. Like most important to be. If you ask me the reason,
I mean, there were leverage. I mean, like internally, right? There was like leverage internal. It was like users on the platform, but like it was misproper use of leverage internally in FTX that caused it to collapse.
Exactly. And so like the question is, right, would you have been a user of FTX had all their activity being on chain, right? Like if you would have known exactly what they were doing, would you have been a user of FTX? I can tell you, probably no one would have, right? With all the stuff that they were doing, right? So they were just like taking users' deposits, and I mean, like if your activity is fully on chain, which means it's fully transparent, like it is with DeFi, like there you remove, I think, the main obstacle, right? The main reason why, the main risk of that FTX, that the centralized exchanges like FTX pose. There's no transparency. You don't know what they're doing, right? Just to trust them, right? So there's that, right? So for Terra collapse, I mean, I want to talk about, like, there's two ways you can use leverage, right? There is responsible way of using leverage, and then there is like massive leverage, right? Even going back, so my background is traditional finance, right? Even going back to traditional finance, like the 2008 collapse, right? Like massive leverage on credit default swaps and then derivatives and all that, right? So then people would say like, man, like leverage is bad, but really
the problem there was also transparency.
Yeah, I mean, for sure. And massive leverage. Like these banks were taking like 20-30x leverage. I mean, massive leverage. Yeah. I mean, there's a point where it doesn't make sense. You can't, the depth, like the risk that you're taking is so high, and the service that you have to, the depth that you have to service is just not, you make one tiny mistake, you're done, right? And the whole system collapses in a cascading way, right? So versus a little bit of leverage, it's always been good. and it's been like it's used properly, right? It's always been good. I mean, the whole point of our financial system in the West, right, of the ability to lend, it's what has made us had Renaissance in Italy and had the West grow the way it has grown, right? So I would argue a little bit of leverage is good, like I don't know, 2-3x, something like that, and a lot of leverage is massive risk. That's what I would say. So, and in the case of like Terra, like like it wasn't just that, it was also kind of like the economics of the system, and then which was like which was that's susceptible to attacks, right? Which we've seen, and there's all sorts of things that happen there that like caused that, but to be honest, to me it was more like the whole anchor concept was maybe not sustainable, to be honest, in the way in the current in that way, right? Maybe they could have like made modifications and made it more sustainable, I think, over time.
Yeah, I'm using leverage here in a sort of hand wavy way, in the sense that but
No, but you're right.
I think I fully agree that, and this is one of the things that after FTX, I think a lot of people in the DeFi space and crypto in general, this was part of the narrative, was that sure that like FTX collapsed, but this is exactly why we need DeFi, because it is transparent. And so with DeFi, you do see all the transactions, you do see where the liquidity is, you do see where, I mean, you have perfect transparency over the entire system, and so therefore are able to make more informed decisions, or have services that help you make more informed decisions in terms of like how you're going to leverage your collateral. And I think that makes more sense. I from a protocol sort of product perspective, I do worry that if DeFi summer 2024 is just a bunch of mega degens over leveraged, and then there are cascading liquidations and like people lose a ton of money, that then there's going to be some challenge in terms of crafting narratives to defend that, and of course then regulators come in, and so as a word of caution, I think it's more as a word of caution to let's not get things out of hand here, where we have like massive leverage and massive pain in the next cycle.
No, for sure. I mean, but this is kind of like the whole the whole financial system is the same concept, right? You have people that take leverage, you have speculators, hedgers, they both are important in the system, both provide liquidity. So it's the same here, like ultimately you want to give the users the ability to get capital efficiency and then make the whole system more efficient. That's ultimately the goal. I mean, just to give you a really banal example, like you can have a pool on osmosis that's not yielding a lot, right? But it's a crucial one that's got the stable pair, right? I don't know. It's not sexy, but you can lever it up 2x. I mean, I'm not saying anything crazy, and all of a sudden, the APY is interesting, and now there's more liquidity, and it ultimately gives better trading prices to people, right? Less slippage. So you can get all this sort of capital efficiency if used in a good way, in a responsible way. Ultimately, it's up to the people, but it's also up to the protocol designers to make sure that the risk parameters are built in a good way, and they're evangelizing the risks that are involved with leverage, because a lot can be risky. There's no doubt, for sure. But to answer your initial question, I think this is what we're going to see, and I think this is the reason why the transition from centralization of trading activity and then sort of like crypto activity, right, from in exchanges to DeFi, decentralized finance, which is really where it should be. And I think that's what we'll see more and more, and that's what Mars is trying to do, is trying to give users this like amazing user experience where they can go into one place and then do all their DeFi activities in a capital efficient way.
Great. Well, that's a great note to end on, and so I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and giving me an overview of Mars. I've learned a lot here, and hopefully for the next one we can dive even deeper in some of the economics, but also hopefully by then Mars will have continue to grow, and we'll have like significant usage, and lots of chains onboarded, someone here was asking when Mars on wind, and maybe just quickly here, if you want to address that, if you have any insights here.
I don't have any. Unfortunately, I don't have any insights. I wish. I think for now we're in the immediate future we're focused on Osmosis, which again I'm gonna say it again. They're an amazing team, awesome chain. There's a lot that we can do there. We're just starting, right? So I'm really excited to keep working with them. I think they're great. They're just an amazing chain.
Cool. Well, thanks so much for coming on once again, and we'll chat soon.
Sounds good. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.